We present to our fellows and the conservative movement a new conservatism based on that old idea that all men are created equal, and that only with a firm understanding of this and of constitutional government will we remain free. And with our litigation center headed by John Eastman, who you all got to meet earlier, we make the case, he makes the case before the highest courts in the land. To be clear, it takes the right arguments and the right person making those arguments. When we decided who to honor this year, it was not really a hard call. We looked to someone making the right argument. We honor the senator from Texas this evening for the statesmanlike act of standing nearly by himself against the implementation of Obamacare. As Senator Cruz explained, Obamacare is unlike any other law. It's not merely that it won't work. We have many public policies that won't work. The problem is that it seeks to change fundamentally the relationship of a citizen to his government, to the point where he is hardly a free citizen. In his opposition to Obamacare, Senator Cruz expressed the common sense of the American people, the kind of common sense that knows that you cannot take over the American healthcare system and have it run by government bureaucrats, that there is something unjust about that, and indeed un-American about such a proposition that has now become law. In doing so, Senator Cruz has established in the public mind that there is someone who is willing to stand and stake his political career in defense of the Constitution. As I say, we study statesmen, American statesmen, as well as the great statesmen of the past, including Winston Churchill, who led the free world at the time of great peril. We see another great peril today. Our Constitution is in disarray. Our political elites are in disrepute. Our enemies, Russia, China, and the world of Islamic terrorism, are aligned against us. We are in a time that calls for a Washington or a Churchill or a Reagan. Now, some may wonder why we give this award to Senator Cruz so early in his career. After all, we gave it to Ronald Reagan after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and to Margaret Thatcher after she retired as Prime Minister. Clarence Thomas was on the Supreme Court. Bill Bennett had a lifetime of service to his country. After all, one filibuster does not a career make. We give him this award tonight because I suspect his actions last year might be the least consequential of his career. For greater challenges, as I say, lie ahead for this country and for him. And so we give our Statesmanship Award not so much for what he has done, but for what he has yet to do. For the great courage and the great promise he has shown in defense of our Constitution, and for all that he has yet to do to defend it and our country. The promise that when dark times come, and come they will, America will most certainly need the senator from Texas to have the same courage then as he does now. It is my great pleasure and privilege to present the Claremont Institute Statesmanship Award to the senator from Texas, the Honorable Ted Cruz.
Thank you, Senator. The statue's over there. We'll take it later, okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for that tremendous welcome. Wow. And I will say I am truly humbled by Brian, that incredibly kind introduction. And in particular, to be given an award named after the great Sir Winston Churchill. I will note there may be one person on the planet who would find that comparison not altogether crazy. And that would be Barack Obama. Because I'm pretty sure that he also would like to send my head back to England. Let me say, it is great to be with so many dear friends. It is great to be back in California. It is great to be with wonderful friends like tremendous voices for liberty on the radio like Hugh Hewitt and Bill Bennett. God bless you both, gentlemen. It is great to be with my old friend John Eastman. He and I clerked together on the Supreme Court, and John is fantastic. It is great to be with my dear friend Foster Friess. What a powerful voice for freedom and someone that fights every day to save this country. And I just have to thank you also because you have given me the opportunity to come back to the home of my wife and the love of my life, Heidi Cruz. So Heidi is a native Californian. She grew up in San Luis Obispo. She is a graduate of Claremont McKenna. In fact, she helped found the college Republicans at Claremont McKenna. And I will note, not only are you giving me an opportunity to come back to her home, but in fact, to be with my in-laws, Peter and Suzanne Nelson, who are both here. Now, I will tell you, California and Texas are kind of different cultures. You know, Heidi and I met about 14 years ago when we were both working on the Bush campaign. We were both staffers on the full-time campaign. We're actually one of 8 marriages came out of that campaign. Leads to a lousy joke I've told many, many times. Whatever anyone else says about George W. Bush, in our house, he will always be a uniter and not a divider. But I can tell you, I will always remember November right before the election, when it so happened that Peter and Suzanne were down in Fort Worth for a family wedding. They'd come from California to Fort Worth. It's the first time I had a chance to meet them. And I was fully smitten and in love with their daughter and was trying to screw up the courage to ask Peter for permission to marry his daughter. And it so happened that this family wedding went after the wedding to Billy Bob's, which is this gigantic country western honky-tonk. There was a Willie Nelson concert in the background, a mechanical bull in the corner. And I managed to pull Peter aside and am trying to ask him, and you need to understand, my father-in-law is a remarkable man. He and Suzanne were missionaries when Heidi was a little girl. He's a dentist. They have a heart for service across the world. But he also climbed Mount Everest, which is just kind of mildly terrifying. I'm fully at peace with the fact that my father-in-law can whip my tail. But when I pulled Peter aside and I asked him for permission to marry his daughter, his response was, well, let me think about it. I'll think about it tonight and I'll tell you tomorrow. So the next day, we had their family and our family come together. We had a brunch the next day. He pulled me aside. He said, well, I talked to Suzanne, and we decided we're not ready to give up our daughter. But we are ready to gain a son. There were 4 full seconds between those two statements. And it has been an incredible 14 years and the 14 years since then. Now, of all of the wonderful things that Heidi has done, the most wonderful is that she has produced, together we have produced our two little girls, Caroline and Catherine. They are the most precious things in our lives. Caroline is 5. Catherine's 3. Catherine is sweet. She is just a sweet, sweet, sweet little girl. Caroline is a rascal. It is how God made her. When she came into this world, she was a rascal. So last fall, we were up in D.C. during the government shutdown. It was the fall. Sunday afternoon, we decided to drive down to Mount Vernon. Let the girls go see Mount Vernon. We're driving down the George W. Parkway. The leaves are turning. They're orange and red and beautiful colors, and the girls are in their car seats behind us. And Caroline, who's kicking the seat with me driving in front of her, asks her little sister, Catherine, says, Catherine, what do you want to do when you grow up? And Catherine, the 3-year-old, says, I want to work in the U.S. Senate. I want to work with Daddy. And Caroline says, oh, that's boring. We're going to be rock stars. And then she throws in the kicker. She says, besides, Daddy will be dead by then. To say this is a true story. I'm driving the truck going, hello, I'm right in front of you. I kind of wondered if maybe Caroline had been speaking with Republican leadership. It is a privilege. It is an honor to be with you this morning. The Claremont Institute stands for the American idea. Each of you supporting what Claremont does is incredibly important. And it's a privilege to celebrate Sir Winston Churchill this evening. This is a time of crisis in our nation and in the world. And it's an excellent time to reflect on the legacy of Churchill. And I have to say that I'm especially honored that we're joined by one of our nation's greatest thinkers and scholars, Dr. Harry Jaffa. The legacy that Dr. Jaffa has led, equipping generation after generation of young people to go forth and fight for the principles that have made this nation strong, is a legacy that is incredible and will bear fruit for generations to come. You know, I recently read Dr. Jaffa's monograph, Can There Be Another Winston Churchill? And Dr. Jaffa concluded that Churchill was able to lead his country because the British people, quote, trusted him as they could none other. Because they trusted him, they accepted their duty and bore it onwards both in triumph and in tragedy. That's something that I hope gives us inspiration. That we too can trust the American people to rise up as the British people did in World War II to deal with tragedy and ultimately to triumph. What I'd like to speak to you about tonight is 2 things. 1, the great challenges facing our nation today. And 2, the path forward to victory, to overcoming those challenges, because the one message more than anything else that I come to you with tonight is a message of hope and optimism and promise there are better days ahead. Let's start with the challenges, though. In 1936, Churchill addressed the House of Commons in his wilderness years. Churchill said, owing to past neglect, in the face of the plainest warnings, we have now entered upon a period of danger. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays in Obamacare is coming to the close. And in its place, we are entering a period of consequences. I believe we are entering a period of consequences today in America. And despite the plainest of warnings, we face three grave threats. We face, number one, a global loss of American leadership that is making the world a more and more dangerous place. We face, number two, a continued economic stagnation that is making it harder and harder for people who are struggling to achieve the American dream. And we face, number three, a president who has behaved in a consistently lawless manner, undermining the Constitution and undermining our rule of law. Let's talk globally first. Globally, we have seen the United States recede from leadership. And when the United States recedes from leadership, that vacuum is filled by nations like Russia and Iran and China. Vladimir Putin wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying it's dangerous for Americans to believe in exceptionalism. And I'm sorry to say, it appears that President Obama has taken his advice. I will say this, Mr. Putin was right. It has proven dangerous throughout the course of history to tyrants and those who would oppress their fellow man and those who would stifle freedom. When Americans understood the exceptionalism that has made this nation the greatest nation on earth. But unfortunately, instead of clarity, instead of defense of our values, from the White House we hear tortured semantics. So from the White House, a, quote, kinetic action is used to glamorize the failed policy of leading from behind in Libya. A, quote, spontaneous protest is used to explain the coordinated al-Qaeda attack that murdered 4 Americans in Benghazi. The interim agreement over Iran's nuclear weapons programs, described by one of our closest allies as an historic mistake, is in the Obama universe described as a, quote, display of international unity. And most recently, in just recent weeks, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was euphemistically designated by the White House as, quote, an uncontested arrival. These are the words of fools. Truth has power, and the United States has a responsibility to stand up and speak with a clarion voice for freedom for every heart that yearns free across the globe. Domestically right now, we see the lowest labor force participation in this country since 1978. From 2008 to 2012, our economy has grown 0.9% a year. There's only one other period since World War II of 4 consecutive years of less than 1% growth. That was 1979 and 1982. It's coming out of the Jimmy Carter administration. Same failed economic policies, out of control spending and taxes and regulation led to the same economic stagnation. And I'll tell you, the people who have been hurt the most by the Obama economy, they haven't been the rich. The media would tell you Republicans are the party of the rich. But you know, the top 1% in this country earn a higher share of our income than any time since 1928. Big business does great with big government, gets in bed with big government, has armies of lobbyists and lawyers and accountants. The people who have been hurt by the Obama economy have been the most vulnerable among us. They've been young people, they've been Hispanics, they've been African Americans, they've been single moms, they have been those struggling to climb the economic ladder and achieve the American dream. You know, I try to think of every policy issue we face from the perspective of my dad 57 years ago. 57 years ago, my father fled Cuba. He'd been in prison. He'd been tortured as a teenager in Cuba. And when he came to Texas, he was 18. He couldn't speak English. He had $100 sewn into his underwear. I don't actually advise carrying money in your underwear. And he washed dishes making 50 cents an hour to pay his way through college, to go on to start a small business, to work towards the American dream. If my dad was still washing dishes today, the odds are very high he would have lost his job because of $1.7 trillion in new taxes, because of crushing regulations that are hammering small businesses that generate 2/3 of the new jobs in our economy. If he hadn't lost his job, if he was lucky enough to keep it, the odds are almost 100% he would have been forced to work 28, 29 hours a week, because the threshold for Obamacare is 30 hours a week. And you can't feed your kids, you can't pay your way through college on 28, 29 hours a week. We're facing a crisis that millions of people are finding it harder and harder to achieve the American dream. And a third crisis is the pattern of lawlessness and abuse of power from this administration. We've never seen a president who, if he disagrees with a law, simply won't enforce it. On immigration laws, on marriage laws, on welfare laws, on drug laws, if he disagrees with them, he simply refuses to enforce it. There's been no more staggering illustration of lawlessness than the enforcement or non-enforcement of Obamacare. The statute says the employer mandate kicks in January 1st, 2014. The President of the United States unilaterally says, no, it doesn't. The statute says members of Congress are subject to Obamacare. The President of the United States unilaterally says, no, they're not. The statute required that over 6 million people have had their health insurance plans canceled, despite the repeated promise, if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep it. Now, normally, Hugh, what every other president would have done for 43 presidents before him is, when you have a law that is a disaster that's hurting millions of people, you go to Congress. You say, let's change it, let's fix it, let's make it work, let's stop causing harms to people across this country. Instead, what did he do? He held a press conference in which he instructed private insurance companies, go and issue policies that are illegal under the statute. Go violate the law. In over 200 years of our country's history, we've never had a president of the United States instruct private citizens, go ignore the law, violate the law on presidential whim. And I got to note, this should be an issue. This is not a partisan issue. This should trouble Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, anyone who believes in rule of law. Because if you have a president who can pick and choose which laws to follow and which to ignore, you no longer have a president. So there is an urgency to what we face right now. You know, the most common thing I hear traveling the country is men and women come up to me, they put their hands on my shoulder, they look me in the eye, they say, Ted, I'm scared. I'm scared for this country. I am scared that my kids and grandkids are not going to inherit the freedom and opportunity we've been blessed to have. The window to turn this country around is not wide. It is now or never. And so what I want to talk about now is how we turn this country around. Now, there's a debate in Washington about what the right approach is to win these arguments, to turn the country around, to pull back from the fiscal and economic brink. And there's some in Washington who say that the winning approach is to stick your head down, don't rock the boat, and for Lord's sakes, don't stand for anything. They say with this world weariness, this sense of wisdom, now, lad, you've got to win elections. And standing for principle is inconsistent with winning elections. What I want to suggest to you is that is a false dichotomy. So let's talk about how we win, how we turn this around, how we turn this country around. I want to use 4 examples from history. Number 1, Churchill and Chamberlain. You know, Churchill famously said, politics are almost exciting as war and quite as dangerous. In war, you can be only killed once. In politics, many times. I'm familiar with that. September 1938, Chamberlain came back to England and told his people, quote, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British prime minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Go home and get a nice, quiet sleep." That was one approach. Churchill had a very different approach. Churchill had a very different approach, knowing that he could not acquiesce to what was happening in Europe, that appeasement would not succeed. And in fact, you look to earlier in Churchill's career. Churchill had been there when the situation was most dire in World War I, when most of the French government has resigned itself to surrendering to the Germans on the ground that the war simply could not be won, and it was better to retreat than to die. Churchill heard French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger, explain his views. "My policy is victory. Home politics, I wage war. Foreign politics, I wage war. Russia betrays us, I continue to wage war. We will fight before Paris. We will fight behind Paris. We will fight, if necessary, to the Pyrenees. I will continue until the very last quarter of an hour, for the last quarter of an hour will be ours." Churchill heard those words as a young man, and the world heard them echoed when he, as an older man, on June 4th, 1940, now as Prime Minister himself, told the House of Commons, "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Two different approaches. Two very different outcomes. Let's fast forward to a more recent outcome, one that many of the men and women in this room are intimately familiar with, which is 1976 and the contest between Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan. You know, Ronald Reagan in 1964 in his Time for Choosing speech said, "You and I are increasingly told we have to choose between a left and a right. But I would like to suggest there's no such thing as a left or a right. There is only an up or down. Up to man's age-old dream, the ultimate and individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course." In 1976, that conflict came to a head as Ronald Reagan, you'll remember, primaried a sitting Republican president. A lot of people talk about Reagan's 11th commandment today without acknowledging that he primaried a sitting Republican president because he believed it was important for Republicans actually to stand for something. That this wasn't just a team sport where you wear a red or blue sweater and you all do the same thing. We saw the chart of government spending over the years. A cynical friend of mine once suggested Republicans should come up with a bumper sticker. Republicans, we waste less. Reagan in '76 said we need to stand for something. The New York Times analyzed later, quote, "As president, Ford had crucial favors to give away, from meals at the White House to seats on the deck of a carrier, the Forrestal, anchored in New York Harbor when he reviewed tall ships on July 4th, 1976, the nation's bicentennial. At the convention, his forces repeatedly surrendered to Reagan's team on platform issues, unwilling to risk floor votes that would confirm Ford adman Stuart Spencer's view. As he put it recently, even then, Reagan owned the heart of the Republican Party. And well-known Republicans attacked Reagan mercilessly. One well-known conservative columnist said in 1974, quote, "Reagan's hardcore support today consists primarily of the kamikaze conservatives who thought the 1964 Goldwater campaign was jolly fun." Now, I will note that phrase, kamikaze conservatives, is still used today. Now, Ford got the nomination and he went on to lose. But that election set the stage for 1980, when a grassroots movement swept the country, when Reagan stood and painted with bold colors, not pale pastels. And in 1980, he won with a landslide. Reagan won 51% to 41%, which in 1984 he grew to 57%. He did it through drawing a distinction. Not through following the policy of put your head down, don't rock the boat, but drawing a line in the sand. He did that domestically, he did it on foreign policy. Remember the contrast with Reagan between détente, which I'm pretty sure is French for surrender, and the clarity of Ronald Reagan, who said, the Soviet Union is an evil empire. Ah! What a horrifying thing for him to say. Who said, Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. The cognoscenti, the intelligentsia all said, what a Philistine view. They were right. They didn't realize it would be rejuvenated in the DNC platform. When they asked him, what's your strategy on the Cold War? He said, it's very simple. We win, they lose. And when Reagan uttered the most important words uttered by a leader in modern times, when he stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Can you imagine that clarity coming from the White House today? How do you win? Let's take a third example. Let's take a third example, the 1990s of Bob Michel versus the Republican Revolution of 1994. Now, Illinois Congressman Bob Michel served in Congress for 38 years. He was minority leader of the House of Representatives for 14 years. During all that time, he never once served in a Republican majority. He never became Speaker. According to Time magazine, and I'm going to read this, this is a real quote. Former Illinois Representative Robert Michel, who would himself take the position of minority leader, told GOP freshmen in the 1970s, every day I wake up and look in the mirror and say to myself, today you're going to be a loser. He continued, and after you're here a while, you'll start to feel the same way. But don't let it bother you. You'll get used to it. That is a real quote. I encourage you, go and Google it, and you wonder why we never won. It is a philosophy that has long predecessors. And yet what happened in 1994? A crazy bunch of revolutionary bomb throwers led by a man named Newt Gingrich said, how about instead of being content to be the minority, we go to the American people with a contract with America and say, there is a better way than the path we're on. And in 1994, there was an historic tidal wave of an election as the American people responded to leadership. And let me give the fourth and final example, which is the Washington establishment versus free market conservatives. Let's take the last four congressional elections, 06, 08, 10, and 12. Three of the four, 06, 08, and 12, we followed the philosophy of the Washington consultants. Put your head down, don't rock the boat, don't stand for anything. And got walloped election after election after election. The only one in which the result was different was 2010. 2010, we drew a line in the sand, said we are going to repeal every single word of Obamacare. We're going to turn around the national debt that is bankrupting this country. We're going to get back to defending the freedom and the liberty of every American. And 2010 was an epic tsunami that transformed Congress. Now, what does all of Washington say? They look at that record and they say, well, 2014, 2016, let's go back to what we did in 06, 08, and 12. Einstein famously said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. This dichotomy, let's look at it in presidential races. The last 40 years, the most consistent pattern you can see in presidential races is when Republicans nominate a candidate who runs as a strong conservative, Republicans win. And when we nominate a candidate who runs as an establishment moderate, we lose. Go back to 1968. 1968, 1972, Richard Nixon runs as a strong conservative, doesn't govern as one, but runs as one. Wins, in 72, wins a landslide. 76, Gerald Ford runs as a moderate, loses. 80 and 84, Reagan runs as a strong conservative, wins in 84, wins 49 of 50 states, in the electoral college, 57% of the popular vote nationwide. 88, I think this is the most striking example in the entire litany. George Herbert Walker Bush runs as a strong conservative, runs as the third term of Reagan, continue the Reagan Revolution, and wins. 92, after 4 years after raising taxes, Bush runs as an establishment moderate and loses. Same candidate, two very different elections, two very different results. 1996, you've got Bob Dole. 2000, 2004, George W. Bush. 2008, John McCain. 2012, Mitt Romney. And what does all of Washington say? Every consultant in Washington says, what do we need in 2016? Another establishment moderate. Why? Hadn't worked in 4 decades. But the next time will be different. The stakes are too serious to keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. You know, in 2012, over 2 million voters who traditionally vote Republican stayed home. Didn't show up. Many of whom were evangelical Christians or Reagan Democrats, ethnic Catholics up and down the Rust Belt. Florida, Obama won by 74,000 votes, less than 1%. Ohio, 166,000 votes. Colorado, 138,000 votes. Iowa, 92,000 votes. Nevada, 68,000 votes. New Hampshire, 40,000 votes. Virginia, 149,000 votes. The margin there is a total of 727,000 votes, less than 1 million votes, which would have produced 84 electoral votes, more than enough to win. You know, there's an old adage in politics that's often quoted, the Nixonian adage, which is you run to the right in the primary, you run to the left in the general. I think it's complete hogwash. And here's why. It's based on the consultant's view that there's a spectrum of voters. So if your opponent is here, the goal is to be infinitesimally to the right of them, so you get every marginal voter right up until them. The problem is, if you do that, you destroy any reason anyone has to show up and vote. Elections are about choices. Look, the model I think all of us should look to is 1980. I don't know about you, does anyone remember Ronald Reagan saying in 1980, "My fellow Americans, I am exactly like Jimmy Carter"? Except imperceptibly, immeasurably, just a tiny bit more conservative. What Ronald Reagan did in 1980 is he drew a line in the sand. He said, "My fellow Americans, President Carter and I have a fundamentally different vision for this nation. President Carter thinks government is the answer to every need, every want, every desire you might have. I think government's the problem." I think it is a false dichotomy. If we want to win, if we want to turn this country around, if we want to pull back from the fiscal and economic ledge, we will not do so by shirking away from a bold, principled, optimistic, hopeful vision for America. We will not do so without giving a clear choice as to why elections matter. As Margaret Thatcher famously said, "First you win the argument, then you win the vote." I want to close with a final word of encouragement. If you remember nothing that I said tonight, well, then you probably had too much wine with dinner. But if you remember just one thing that I said tonight, let it be this, that I am profoundly optimistic and hopeful. Where we are today reminds me a great deal of the late 1970s. The late 1970s, you had Jimmy Carter in the White House. By the way, I have to note, if there is one person on earth who is thrilled with the job Barack Obama is doing, it's Jimmy Carter. You had the same misguided economic policies that led to stagnation, led to suffering. You had the same feckless foreign policy. You had Iran holding our hostages 444 days while the president wrung his hands unsure of what to do. You had the President of the United States coming on television, telling Americans, "Accept malaise and put on a sweater." And what happened? What happened was a grassroots movement of millions of men and women across this country that became the Reagan Revolution. A lot of the men and women in this room were part of that. It didn't come from Washington. Go back and read what they said in 1976 and 1980 about Reagan. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. They said he was a crazy cowboy that's going to lead us into World War II. He's not a team player. It didn't come from Washington, and you know what? The answers now are not going to come from Washington either. They're going to come from the American people. That grassroots movement, millions of men and women, a lot of whom had not been involved in politics, had been happily leading their lives until they looked up and said, "What are we doing to our great country?" That movement transformed this country, turned this country around. And let me tell you, one of the great blessings of serving in the office that Texans have privileged me with the opportunity to serve is that I have a chance to travel the country, to listen to people, and it's happening again. The same thing is happening again. Everywhere I go, people are waking up, they're getting energized, they're standing up, and they are saying, "We want our country back." So I salute you. I salute you to your commitment to the American idea. I salute you to your commitment to our founders. I salute you for your commitment to the free market principles and the constitutional liberties that have made this nation great. Because with the American people standing up and coming together, I am convinced that all of us together will bring back morning in America, that we will together restore that shining city on a hill that is the United States of America. Thank you.